people were just handing us beers and just handing us food and just, you know, it's changed my perception of New Orleans coming to see this, you know, to see the energy of the city and just, yeah, there's no place I'd rather be.
Oh, and it was quite the scene if you watched any of the live streams that some of the bars and restaurants have there on Bourbon Street. By the way, as our friends at WGNO down in New Orleans like to tell us, the carnival season may be over, but now it's time for festival season.
It's always a blast. It's always a party.
In the Big Easy. That's what's making news in America this morning.
Have a great day.
It's Wednesday, February 22nd. One man was in Poland, one in Russia, with Ukraine caught in the middle. We start here. President Biden issues a call to the world to stand by Ukraine.
Well, I've just come from a visit to Kyiv, and I can report Kyiv stands strong.
But Vladimir Putin gave a speech of his own. Are we about to embark on a new arms race? The Supreme Court seemed ready to go full geek squad until they didn't.
They may have bitten off a bit more than they can chew.
Could this signal a major victory for tech companies? And call it infrastructure bleak.
They fight safety regulations tooth and nail. That's got to change.
The growing argument over train regulations in this country and what lawmakers might actually do about it. From ABC News, this is Start Here. I'm Brad Milkey. When President Biden traveled to Kyiv this week under the cover of darkness to address the war-torn nation of Ukraine, it wasn't just a signal to the people there. It was a signal to the broader region. Well, yesterday, safely out of Ukraine, right across the border in Poland, Biden made that signal even clearer.
1 year ago, the world was bracing for the fall of Kyiv. Well, I just come from a visit to Kyiv, and I can report Kyiv stands strong. Kyiv stands proud. It stands tall. And most important, it stands free.
In a fiery speech in Warsaw, President Biden declared that while the war in Ukraine would go on, the most fundamental battle had already been decided. The battle for Ukrainian hearts and minds, he said, is over. And yet Biden wasn't the only leader giving a closely watched speech yesterday.
I'm giving this state address in a very difficult context and a very difficult time for our country.
In Moscow, Russian President Vladimir Putin gave a lengthy address, and there were consequential announcements there. Let's start the day with ABC's foreign correspondent Patrick Reevell, who's in Ukraine right now. Patrick, can we start with Biden? I mean, what stuck out to you about his address in Poland?
Yeah, Brad, I think the first thing that stuck out to me was Biden saying that Ukraine will never be a victory for Vladimir Putin, and saying that basically a year ago, in that very dark day when the invasion began, you know, this was a huge challenge not only for Ukraine, but for the whole world.
Europe was being tested. America was being tested. NATO was being tested. All democracies are being tested. And the questions we faced were as simple as they were profound. Would we respond? Or would we look the other way? Would we be strong? Or would we be weak?
And that Ukraine still stands, that Kyiv still stands, and that democracy still stands. And I think the second thing that really stuck out to me was him saying that there are dark days ahead still, that, you know, it's sort of cheesy line, but freedom isn't free.
The defense of freedom is not the work of a day or of a year. It's always difficult. It's always important.
And what he means by that is that, yes, Ukraine has managed to fight off the Russians and truly has fought them off, but the war obviously is still grinding on and is actually the bloodiest it's ever been. And Vladimir Putin is as determined as ever to try and clinch some kind of victory from it.
Brutality will never grind down the will of the free. And Ukraine will never be a victory for Russia. Never.
And so Biden's message was really steeling the American people and also the people of Europe that they need to stay the course, they need to keep backing Ukraine, and that this is going to be a long war and that this is not going to be easy.
Well, that sounds like one of the answers to my next question, which is why? Why did Biden feel the need to not just speak out in Kyiv, but then go to Poland and make this kind of evening speech that would be seen by so much of the world? Like, what was the message he's really trying to convey elsewhere?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of people are seeing it saw obvious parallels to a sort of Cold War moment, really, sort of Ronald Reagan or Kennedy in Berlin, standing there and throwing out this challenge to Moscow.
He thought autocrats like himself were tough and leaders of democracy were soft. And then he met the iron will of America and the nations everywhere that refused to accept the world governed by fear and force.
This is the free world, and you will not intimidate us. But I think ultimately, most of all as well, he's trying to rally the American people behind supporting Ukraine, because we're seeing a slight flagging in the US. A poll by ABC and the Washington Post showed that the number of Americans who feel that the US is doing too much has slightly grown. It's grown from 14% to around 30% now of the American public think that the US is doing too much. And that's because I think in their eyes, it's becoming more difficult to see this as an existential fight, and it's becoming more about land in eastern Ukraine. And I think Biden is trying to remind people of what the stakes of this war actually are.
Over the past year, Democrats and Republicans in our United States Congress have come together to stand for freedom. That's who Americans are, and that's what Americans do.
That this is a standoff between a vision of the world, essentially, whether you can have your sovereign independent country and the right to be a democracy that chooses its own path, or whether you give in to autocracy and the vision of the world as Vladimir Putin sees it.
Well, if he's trying to outline the stakes, I mean, there are also stakes, there are also consequences to engaging yourself with Russia like this, right? And at the same time, on the same day, Vladimir Putin was giving an address in Russia in which he's announcing, like, Russia's no longer going to be participating in the START treaty, the nuclear treaty. What did you take away from that kind of split screen with Putin?
Yeah, we were watching Vladimir Putin's speech very closely. It's his equivalent of the State of the Union. And as we watched it, it was very much vintage Putin. It was almost like listening to an old record, really, where he blamed the West for the war, that, you know, they're surrounded by a hostile world, that they need to rely totally on themselves, that there are Nazis next door in Ukraine.
And I want to repeat this. They started the war, and we used our force in order to stop it.
The only news suddenly comes at the end, and actually something that's a very big deal. He announced that Russia is suspending its participation in the New START treaty, which is the last remaining major nuclear arms control deal between Russia and America.
The more long-range Western weaponry Ukraine is supplied with, the further we will have to push the danger from our borders.
He said he wasn't actually fully leaving the deal for now, but obviously this is him ripping up a key agreement that limits, in theory, a nuclear arms race between the US and Russia. In many ways, it kind of also reflects his powerlessness at the moment to really shape things as he wants, to shape the conflict in Ukraine. Because obviously what he would like to be able to do is decisively settle the conflict there and intimidate the US and its allies into stop backing Ukraine. But all he's got is to tear up this arms agreement that was already in quite serious trouble because it relies on a good deal of cooperation between Russia and the US, and that already wasn't happening very much because relations have been in the deep freeze for so long. But of course it does matter. It really is another turn in this spiral of descent into a more dangerous world, really.
I see, which makes you think perhaps more sort of political than anything, considering it's not like Russia wants nuclear war with the U.S., and yet it shows this deteriorating relationship in this kind of Cold War 2.0 that Biden's trying to convince the rest of the world is real and needs to be won. Patrick Reevell, they're literally stuck between Poland and Russia right now. They're in Kiev in Ukraine. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Brad.
Next up on Start Here, first YouTube, now Twitter. The tech company's full court press continues after the break.
With so much at stake, so much on the line, more Americans turn here than any other newscast. ABC News World News Tonight with David Muir, America's #1 most watched newscast across all of television. After an extraordinary news-making year, thank you for making ABC's This Week America's #1 news and politics show on Sunday mornings.
Bring them on. If only there was a place in the morning to start my day. With a smile Somewhere to help me get in the know. A place as spectacular as, well, me.
I think we might know a place, right, guys?
Bring your friends. Oh, wait, there is.
Good morning, America.
GMA, 7A, every day. Boom, boom, boom.
Good morning, Michael.
Good morning, Robin. Good morning, America. How are you?
Boom! Now that's how you start your day, people.
We talked yesterday about this huge case going in front of the Supreme Court about this decades-old rule at the FCC. And the more tech experts you talk to, the more you hear that Americans are just not aware of how big a deal this could potentially be.
Some companies are going to over-sanitize their services, and they'll err on the side of caution. And others, meanwhile, are just going to stick their heads in the sand, and they'll abdicate completely.
Remember, this is a rule. It's called Section 230 that says you can't be sued if you're just a website letting people talk online. Whoever's typing a message could potentially be sued, but if you're just an open forum, you can't be held responsible any more than the corkboard maker at the local coffee shop. What flyers people post there is their business. And remember, this is enacted right before Google.com is a thing. Perhaps more than any other regulation, this allowed sites like YouTube and Facebook and Twitter to thrive. Well, yesterday, the Supreme Court heard this case, and guess what? There's another case today that could break the internet as well. So let's go to ABC's legal contributor, Kate Shaw, to break this down for us. Kate, I'd have to imagine if the justices had no interest in changing this law, they wouldn't have taken the case, right? Like, what was the vibe that you got from them?
I think that's right, Brad. When the justices agreed to hear both yesterday's case and today's case, the signal it seemed to send was that the justices were interested in changing the rules of the road for the internet. Why otherwise would they have taken these questions up at all?
You seem to have abandoned that and are saying they don't have to take it off their website. Am I correct about that?
That's exactly right. That
so
was the way we framed the question presented. We
so that
did not
can't
advance that claim.
So you're abandoning that claim. So that can't be aiding and abetting.
But honestly, coming out of yesterday's argument, my sense is that they may have bitten off a bit more than they can chew, and that actually they're not very likely to kind of upend life on the internet as we know it.
What gave you that impression? That this institution that doesn't allow computers in the room, they're not tech engineers, you're saying?
Well, the best line of the argument has to go to Justice Elena Kagan, who basically said, kind of self-deprecating, but maybe also kind of throwing a little bit of shade at her colleagues. She said, and I quote, "These are not like
the 9 greatest experts on the internet."
That's her description of the justices of the Supreme Court. And that's fair. They're not. So I think as they waded into these questions of how they might change the potential liability of entities like, Google and YouTube or Twitter in today's case, limiting the kind of immunity that these sorts of providers have historically enjoyed under Section 230 is a complex undertaking that's going to have very significant consequences financially, in terms of our collective online lives, in any number of ways, and that maybe they don't have the kind of expertise that is required to decide how to change the nature of the internet, that if somebody's going to change how Section 230 works, that really that should be Congress and not the 9 experts on the internet who sit on the Supreme Court.
But good luck finding a tech expert in Congress either. I'm looking at the Senate panels. No, thank you. But I mean, so what is up for grabs here conceivably? Are there any sort of gray areas or any spots where it's this could be reined in, or this is a spot that needs to be looked at specifically? Or is it just blanket immunity? That's the answer.
It's pretty clear that platforms like Google, and it's really YouTube that's at issue in yesterday's case, but of course Google owns YouTube. So Google or Twitter, it's pretty clear that under Section 230, they can't be sued for the actual content that a user posts. But the case sort of asks about whether they might be able to be held liable for the algorithms that they use that actually serve up content to users.
They're affirmatively recommending things. You turn on your computer, and the computers at YouTube send you stuff you didn't ask them for. They just send you stuff. It's no different than if they were sending you emails. That's affirmative conduct.
And if what they serve up ends up being violent content that contributes to, say, an act of terrorism, then, maybe that's a separate question, their liability for their own algorithms, than their liability for someone else's speech.
Right, because that's the thing, right? The rabbit hole is the thing that scares so many people, that you can be watching something on voter fraud in the 1850s, and if you're not careful, eventually you're listening to like crackpot conspiracy theories. But so if that was YouTube, that was yesterday, today is a case involving Twitter. What is that case about?
This case, like yesterday's, has really tragic facts. It also involves an ISIS attack, this one in a nightclub in Istanbul. And the family members of an individual who was killed in this attack have filed a suit under a statute called the Anti-Terrorism Act, basically claiming they were at least in part responsible for this attack by virtue of the content that their platform served up to individuals that was extremist content that led in part to the growth of ISIS.
I'm trying to get you to explain to us how something that is standard on YouTube for virtually anything that you have an interest in suddenly amounts to aiding and abetting because you're in the ISIS category.
But here, it's really about this argument whether the statute, this Anti-Terrorism Act, gives these plaintiffs the ability to proceed against these tech companies. So in some ways, the answer to the question in yesterday's case, does Section 230 prevent these suits from going forward at all? That's the most important question, I think, in both of these cases, and really in any case that might be brought against a tech company related in any way to the content on one of those platforms.
And perhaps even more important than the ruling in whatever today's case ends up sounding like is like just this idea that there is this kind of bipartisan moment right now where Democrats, Republicans, conservatives, and liberals all have their own reasons for taking down big tech a peg. What does that end up looking like for everyone? Kate Shaw, thank you.
Thank you, Brad.
In a place like East Palestine, Ohio, distrust can sow even more distrust. When a train ran off the rails in the center of town, many residents went to bed that night thinking it's a bad fire, nothing more. By the time they awoke, the situation had become much more dire.
I just put tape on my door so no chemical can come in.
You don't know what's going to happen. Like, you're just waiting to hear something to explode.
There have been precious few answers on exactly what particulates could still remain in the air, the soil, the water. Residents have been told there are no toxic levels being measured at the moment, but there's still weird smells, weird tastes. That's made residents nervous to trust anyone. Which is a problem when officials do have solid information they need to share. In recent days, some of that distrust has begun to be aimed squarely at perhaps the two most famous faces of rail travel in this country, President Joe Biden, Mr. Infrastructure himself, and his transportation secretary, Pete Buttigieg.
Where's Pete Buttigieg? Where's he at? I don't know. Your guess is as good as me.
Yesterday, Buttigieg went on Good Morning America to answer questions. ABC's Ann Flaherty covers government agencies, and I was kind of surprised to see local officials start to call out Secretary Buttigieg by name. Is the frustration kind of just beginning to build about freight trains writ large?
Well, certainly frustration is growing, I think, because there's no good answers for these residents. But it really took this sharp turn toward partisan bickering.
Stop blaming Donald Trump, a guy who hasn't been president for 3 years, and use the powers of the federal government to do the things necessary to help people in this community.
I mean, you had Republicans showing up on Fox News accusing Biden of forgetting rural Ohio.
I got to say, Secretary Buttigieg has been nowhere to be found on this issue.
And then you've got Biden and his transportation secretary, Buttigieg, as you mentioned. They're blaming the railroad industry.
But there's another side to the story, which is making sure that we move forward on rail safety in this country.
They say that there's so much money that's been poured into politics and this huge corporations that are making billions of dollars, and they haven't taken the kinds of steps that they need to make these freight trains safe. So I think what you have are two sides wrangling over the narrative. So there is this, is the story of politicians in Washington who talk a big game, but they have forgotten the little guy.
Why have we gotten into a position where we're having hundreds of train derailments every year in this country when we just spent $1 trillion on infrastructure?
Is it about a greedy corporation? That's the Democratic line, that these corporations have poured so much money into the political system that it can just act with impunity.
Norfolk Southern, they did major stock buybacks, major dividends. In fact, the total stock buybacks and dividends were greater than the investment they made in rails.
They say that we need to rein it in with more regulation. So that's where the fight stands right now.
But if you run the Department of Transportation, Ann, I mean, do you have the power to fix any of those things? Because I mean, Buttigieg is in charge. The infrastructure package, which deals with trains, like that became law over a year ago. Is there fault to be laid at the feet of the Biden administration here?
So, the infrastructure package, it's not clear what amount of money or precisely what regulatory step could have prevented this disaster. And it always takes time to spend money when it's included in these bills. But certainly there are issues here beyond East Palestine that there was a train derailment, for example, in Nebraska. So this obviously happens. It wasn't with, hazardous waste, so it wasn't as concerning. But there clearly is an issue with infrastructure and with what these companies are allowed to do in the regulatory space.
I got to tell you, ever since I came into this job, I have seen the power that multi-billion-dollar railroad companies wield, and they fight safety regulations tooth and nail. That's got to change.
Buttigieg is going to talk about things like specialized brake systems. Well, they've tried to enforce rules on specialized brake systems with trains. And then Congress came in 2015 and passed a law that said it's not necessary. Well, that was a line from the industry. And it's not really clear how much evidence will back that.
The rail industry has been pushing to be allowed to have trains have only one human being on board. Imagine what happens if there's an issue on a train that's a mile long or longer, and there's only one person to check on something 3/4 of the way back in the train. Now, the last administration froze that rulemaking. We have been advancing that in order to push safety.
That's where people get frustrated, is they see this game that's played in Washington that's not necessarily in their best interest. Nobody really knows what would have prevented this disaster.
Right. Well, and that's what seems so weird here, Ann, is like there's personality and there's policy. Because if you're talking about policy, like, are Republicans going to say we need more regulations? We need to go after CEOs more? Because if not, then it would become more of a personality thing, like the personality of Joe Biden or Pete Buttigieg, who then comes out kind of swinging on the policy thing. And I believe Donald Trump undid some of Barack Obama's rail regulations. So, like, what do you do going forward for either side?
Right. I mean, that goes back to this narrative issue that they're trying to control the storyline. Buttigieg is looking at these large corporations and talking about how much money they make. He's trying to turn their frustration away from him and put it on the corporation. The corporation is saying, look, we've done everything we can. Bad things can happen. We are going to fix it. At the same time, the federal government probably needs to be involved in this in a very, very big way. And we did have the news yesterday that the EPA is going to get involved in this and force the cleanup. And then you have, former President Trump, who's going to show up. Supposedly he's showing up today to visit the area and, to do some photo ops. And the question is, how much of that is really helpful to any of these residents?
And the EPA yesterday said it was ordering Norfolk Southern to basically conduct all the cleanup and to pay for all the cleanup there. Norfolk Southern has put out several statements saying, yeah, we will be paying for all this and that we will sort of honor our commitment to these people in this town. We're also potentially seeing criminal referrals in Pennsylvania right across the state line. So we'll see what comes of that. Ann Flaherty, thanks so much.
Thanks, Brad.
All right, one more quick break. When we come back, if your seafood is genetically enhanced, does that qualify as catfishing? One last thing is next.
America's #1 news, ABC News. Most watched, most trusted, and streaming live to you anytime, anywhere, and free. This is ABC News Live, America's #1 streaming news, free to you 24/7. Watch America's #1 news whenever you want it, wherever you are, anytime. ABC News Live, streaming live and free on all platforms.
Bring them on. If only there was a place in the morning to start my day. With a smile, somewhere to help me get in the know. A place that's spectacular as, well, Me?
I think we might know a place, right, guys?
Bring your friends. Oh, wait, there is.
Good morning, America.
GMA, 7A, every day. Boom, boom, boom.
Good morning, Michael. Good morning, Robin. Good morning, America. How are you?
Boom! Now that's how you start your day, people.
From America's #1 news comes the all-new ABC News app. If you love being in the know, you're gonna love this. Experience the all-new ABC News app. Download it now.
Reporting from the White House, I'm Elizabeth Schulze. Wherever the story is, we'll take you there. You're streaming ABC News Live.
And one last thing. Today is Ash Wednesday, the first day of Lent, which is always the start of busy season.
Catfish there, bud.
Catfish, those mysterious whiskered bottom feeders, have been more difficult to find on a menu over the last couple of years.
Try to slap me on the way.
There are lots of factors for that, including labor shortages, higher temperatures, and higher prices for feed. But recently, scientists have been trying to increase supply by taking aim at another problem: the number of catfish every year that die from infection. Apparently, this is a big issue, goes back years. Catfish are the most farmed fish in America, and our farmers are regularly losing out to foreign suppliers. So, what if all those dead fish didn't die?
It's alive! It's alive! It's alive!
So here's what researchers decided to try. They're injecting alligator DNA into catfish. Yeah, it sounds like a plot for a movie called Catnado. One Alabama journalist said it sounded like a Southern Gothic horror thriller, but this is a real thing.
Humans have been artificially altering the genomes of plants and animals for thousands of years by selective breeding.
Apparently, alligators have a gene that helps them heal quickly after thrashing around in gator fights. That gene, researchers say, can make catfish less prone to disease.
Today, with advances in genetic engineering techniques, means we can speed this process up by incorporating specific new genes from one species into a completely unrelated species.
The study has yet to be peer-reviewed, but if that's true, it could make fish farming a lot less wasteful. And yet, this raises the obvious question: isn't this a recipe for disaster? Before you ask, no, the catfish don't gain alligator attributes. There are not going to be any toothy, pointed snouts. But there is a real concern about what would happen if these super catfish ever escaped into the wild and outperformed their cousins in the ecosystem. As a result, these genes will be injected in a way that sterilize the fish, rendering them unable to breed, which means it would get expensive year after year if people can even be convinced to eat them. There's already something so prehistoric about catfish. You really want to inject them with, of all things, alligator genes? That's what we're doing? All right, just so you know, this would not be the first fish genetic tinkering. A salmon producer was recently approved to add the genes of a bigger, stronger salmon, but that FDA approval took 26 years to receive. Good luck with Ash Wednesday if you're observing. I'm Brad Milkey. See you tomorrow.
So much at stake, so much on the line, more Americans turn here than any other newscast. ABC News World News Tonight.